Grant Wiggins recalls the outcome of a trial. He says that he was not there, but he knew what the verdict would be. He pictures the courtroom, the judge, and the attorneys. He pictures his aunt, Tant Lou, sitting beside the defendant's godmother, Miss Emma, both watching the proceedings with solemn rigidity. Grant can picture the back of Jefferson's close-cropped black head as he sits at the defendant's table. Grant recalls the incidents leading up to the trial. Jefferson, Grant says, was on his way to the White Rabbit Bar and Lounge when Brother and Bear, two young black men, drove up beside him and offered him a ride. The three men drove to a store, where Brother and Bear demanded that Elsie Grape, the store owner, give them drinks on credit. Elsie refused, and the ensuing argument led to a shootout. Elsie, Brother, and Bear all died, leaving Jefferson alone in the store. Grant says Jefferson stood at the scene of the crime, confused and frightened, and took a slug of whiskey to calm his nerves. He looked around and saw the open cash register full of money. He knew that stealing was wrong, but he also knew that he would need to run, so he took some money. He had nearly reached the door when two white men walked into the store. Grant says the prosecution argued that Jefferson had gone to the store intending to rob and kill Elsie Grape. The prosecution claimed that Jefferson stuffed the money into his pockets and celebrated the murder by drinking some of Elsie's liquor. Grant says that Jefferson's attorney defended Jefferson by insisting that he is a boy and a fool, and therefore incapable of planning the robbery and murder. The attorney said he would rather put a hog in the electric chair than such a mindless individual. The white jury members deliberated for just a few hours before finding Jefferson guilty of robbery and murder in the first degree. A few days later, the judge sentenced Jefferson to death by electrocution. When Grant comes home from school on the afternoon of the trial, he finds his aunt, Tant Lou, and Jefferson's godmother, Miss Emma, sitting quietly at the table. He hurries to his room. He knows they want to talk about the trial and wishes desperately to avoid the subject. For courtesy's sake, however, he goes out to the kitchen. He tries to excuse himself quickly, but they insist on talking to him. Grief-stricken, Miss Emma thinks about how Jefferson's attorney compared Jefferson to a hog. She tells Grant that she does not want Jefferson to die a hog and that she wants Grant to accompany her to the prison and teach Jefferson to die with dignity. Grant angrily refuses, insisting he can do nothing to help Jefferson. Tant Lou tells Grant that all three of them must visit Mr. Henry Pitchett, because his brother-in-law, the sheriff, might admit them to see Jefferson. Grant clenches his fists in fury. He wants to scream at his aunt and tell her how much he hates the town and how helpless he feels in this oppressive environment, but he knows that she would not hear him. The first chapter opens with the novel's fundamental concern: how can justice prevail in a society dominated by a single group of people? In Jefferson's trial, the judge is white, the lawyers are white, and every member of the jury is white. Therefore, Jefferson receives a trial not by his peers, but by his oppressors. Jefferson's attorney pleads for Jefferson's innocence by appealing to white prejudices, arguing that Jefferson is as morally blank as a hog. This trial robs Jefferson of his legal rights. Because he is black in a racist society, the law will not help Jefferson. The jurors are not even asked to consider the legality of the situation. Rather, they are asked to acquit him because he is a pathetic creature. On one hand, Gaines condemns the society as racist. To Grant, the trial is an elaborate performance with a predetermined conclusion: Jefferson will be found guilty. Grant understands that in this society, a black man is guilty until proven innocent. Under the law, The prosecution has to prove Jefferson's guilt, but under the rules of convention in this racist society, the prosecution must only concoct a vague theory based on no evidence. Jefferson's attorney defends his client not by using the evidence, but by damning Jefferson as a hog and a fool too stupid to plan such a crime. Grant's decision to stay away from the trial begins to seem not a cynical refusal to hope for a not guilty verdict, but a sensible realization that no matter what the evidence says, Jefferson will be found guilty. On the other hand, Gaines intentionally blurs the truth in this opening chapter, questioning the truth of Grant's statements. At this point, we do not know for sure what happened during the crime. Grant details several different versions of the crime even though he witnessed neither the crime nor the trial. Gaines deliberately leaves the story murky in order to suggest the murkiness of racism in America. Tant Lou, Miss Emma, and Grant arrive at the Pitchett plantation. They enter through the back door and inform the maid that they wish to see Mr. Pitchett. Miss Emma was the cook here for most of her life, just like her mother and grandmother before her. Grant's aunt washed and ironed, and Grant ran errands. When he left for college, he vowed never to enter this place through the back door again. After some delay, Henry Pitchett and Louis Rogon enter the kitchen. Miss Emma asks Pitchett to convince his brother-in-law to allow Grant to visit the prison and educate Jefferson. Pitchett hesitates, and Miss Emma reminds him of all the years she spent working for his family. Pitchett asks Grant what he expects to do, and Grant responds truthfully that he does not know. Grant carefully avoids being disrespectful, making sure to lower his eyes when necessary. After some cajoling, Pitchett agrees to speak to his brother-in-law. After dropping off Miss Emma, Grant informs his aunt that he will eat in town, which insults her. He drives to Bayonne. After crossing the railroad tracks and making his way down a poorly lit road into the black section of town, Grant stops at the Rainbow Club where Thelma Claiborne, the owner's wife, prepares his dinner. At Grant's request, his lighter-skinned girlfriend Vivian arrives. She sits with Grant and they talk quietly. He offers to take her and her children far away from the town, but she considers the idea unrealistic and threatens to leave the bar if he continues to speak about it. She asks him why he has not left town for good, and he replies that he wants to be with her. She calls him a liar, because he once left the town to stay with his parents in California. When Vivian asks him why he returned, Grant avoids the question. She reminds him that they cannot be so open about their love for one another until she finalizes her divorce. While dancing, Grant tells her about Jefferson's sentence. Angry and afraid, Grant wonders if he can teach Jefferson how to die when Grant himself doesn't know how to live. The next morning, Grant returns to the plantation school where he teaches black children through the 6th grade. His school is in a church, and his desk is a table normally devoted to the Sunday collection. Grant teaches only 5.5 months out of the year, because his students work in the fields the rest of the time. In a foul mood, Grant punishes his students for the slightest offenses, though they try to avoid upsetting him. After a few hours, he steps outside and surveys the homes near his school. He knows many details about the troubled lives of their inhabitants. When he returns to his classroom, he finds a student playing with an insect. He sneaks up behind the young boy and slaps him hard across the back of the head with his ruler. Furious, Grant finds himself telling the class about the task Miss Emma has set for him. He explains how Jefferson will die and says he must make Jefferson into a man, which is exactly what he is trying to do with them. Toward the end of class, a small man enters the church and informs Grant that Mr. Henry Pitchett wishes to see him. The main conflict of A Lesson Before Dying lies within Grant himself. Even though Grant struggles to manage in the racist white society, his primary struggle is with his own mind. As he says to Vivian, he cannot face Jefferson because he cannot face himself and his own life. Vivian exposes Grant's conflicted nature by bringing up the fact that he left the South in the past, but eventually returned. Grant feels repulsed by the environment in which he grew up, but somehow he cannot bring himself to leave. Despite his statement that Vivian's presence is the reason that he remains in Bayonne, Vivian knows that there are larger issues at play here. The novel shows that Grant's pride and self-centered qualities prevent him from truly appreciating the people with whom he lives. When he finally learns how to view his family and friends positively, he becomes able to live in the South with strength and courage. Undoubtedly, however, Grant is not completely responsible for his inability to overcome his inner conflict. Life in the South during the time of Jim Crow segregation was harrowing for blacks, and Grant's vacillation between cynical confidence and despair results from his daily struggle against the forces of racism. Here, Gaines paints Grant's visit to Henry Pitchett as a humiliating experience. Grant, Tant Lou, and Miss Emma have to enter Pitchett's house through the servants' entrance in the back and then must wait awkwardly until Pitchett deigns to see them. They talk to Pitchett as servants to master, careful to appear respectful and able to appeal only to his sense of duty and generosity for help. Moreover, as Pitchett oppresses blacks by making them serve and beg, the town of Bayonne oppresses them by segregating them to the back of the town. White families own the plantations and fields, and black families work them. White men run the jails, and black men rot in them. White women bear white children, and black women care for them. Gaines shows that the blacks are not only segregated, but they receive meager resources, such as electricity. The road to the black section of town is noticeably darker than the main streets with streetlights. The inequities of racism also divide blacks from each other. Although Grant is inextricably bound to Tant Lou and Miss Emma, he is also distanced from them. He feels pressured by Tant Lou to conform to the racist expectations of the whites. He drives the women to Pitchett's, yet he cannot stand living as they do, constantly submitting to white authority. He refuses Tant Lou's food in order to show his resentment and disapproval of her behavior. Grant feels both a connection to and a detachment from his pupils. He wants them to thrive, to transcend the low-class work for which they have been slated, but he expresses frustration when they do not exhibit the concentration that will help them thrive. To the extent that he wants his students to succeed and identifies with their plight, Grant is on their side. Just as his aunt angers him, however, his students anger him. He deals with them harshly, punishing them for tiny offenses and making them afraid. Although he cares for them, he frequently seems disgusted by them and convinced that they cannot make anything of themselves. A maid lets Grant into the Pitchett kitchen through the back door. She informs him that Mr. Pitchett's brother-in-law, Sheriff Sam Guidry, will arrive soon. Grant waits in the kitchen, thinking moodily about his role in Jefferson's affairs. After half an hour, Grant hears Sam Guidry and his wife Edna arrive at the front door. After another half hour, Edna enters the kitchen. She asks him many questions, but never gives him an opportunity to answer. She drinks bourbon and she says she feels sorry about Jefferson and the murder. After another hour and 15 minutes, Sheriff Sam Guidry, Henry Pitchett, Louis Rogon, and a fat man walk into the kitchen. Guidry asks Grant how long he has been waiting, and Grant tells him flatly, about 2.5 hours. Grant realizes he should have grinned and said, "Not long," but his anger and pride prevented him from being submissive. Guidry asks what Grant wants to do with Jefferson, and Grant politely answers that he does not know. After a while, the sheriff informs him that he can see Jefferson in a few weeks, although he thinks Grant's efforts will fail and Grant should let Jefferson die a contented hog. Moreover, the sheriff says that Grant will lose his visiting privileges if he aggravates Jefferson. During the next few weeks, Grant awaits the annual visit by the superintendent of schools. He makes sure that his students appear clean and well-behaved, since the superintendent could arrive at any moment. When the superintendent, Dr. Joseph Morgan, finally arrives, Grant notes Dr. Morgan's heaviness and the difficulty with which he gets out of his car. Grant escorts Dr. Morgan to his own desk and then stands with his class. Dr. Morgan calls up several of the boys and girls, choosing the most obviously self-conscious or problematic students. He checks their teeth and asks them to recite Bible verses. He is angry yet vindicated when one young boy fails to recite his lessons properly. Grant thinks of the similarity between Dr. Morgan's inspection and slave masters' inspections. Dr. Morgan lectures the class on the virtues of good nutrition, hygiene, and physical labor, but compliments Grant on his class. Grant complains to the superintendent that most of the school's shabby books are hand-me-downs from white schools. This grievance annoys the superintendent, who says that white schools struggle too. Before leaving, Dr. Morgan suggests that Grant put the children to work in the fields to earn money. The next week, the school receives its first load of wood for the winter. As Grant's students saw and chop the wood, Grant recalls his own elementary school days and his teacher Matthew Antoine. A bitter, defeated man, Mr. Antoine hated teaching and hated his students. Grant calls Mr. Antoine a mulatto, referring to Antoine's mixed race. Because he was a mulatto, Mr. Antoine considered himself superior to blacks and felt contempt for black people who wished to learn in a society that thinks them subhuman. After Grant studied at a university for several years, he returned to the plantation to teach in the school. He went to visit Mr. Antoine, who advised Grant to do his best but did not think Grant could help the situation. According to Mr. Antoine, blacks had but one option in the South: to run away. In these chapters, Gaines illustrates the racism that plagues Grant. Sheriff Guidry agrees to let Grant visit Jefferson, but in warning Grant against aggravating Jefferson, Guidry denies Grant the right to elicit an emotional response from Jefferson. Guidry wishes Jefferson to remain meek and without convictions. Grant's school operates at the mercy of the racist white community, receiving basic supplies like chalk, books, and firewood at the whim of the whites. Dr. Joseph sees the black children as physical laborers and implies blacks should be working in the fields as they did when they were slaves. He compliments Grant's class by calling it a good crop, racist language that suggests Dr. Joseph thinks of the students as objects, not people. Dr. Joseph insists on the importance of hygiene, but Grant notes the poor health of whites. Edna drinks, a fat man grunts like a hog, and Dr. Joseph himself, who insists upon physical exercise for the black children, is so fat he can hardly get into his car. While he notes the blatant examples of white racism, Gaines also delves into the murky areas where stereotypes begin to dissolve. While Grant despises Dr. Joseph for believing that black children should grow up to work on white plantations, Grant observes that the two men who bring the wood to the school truly enjoy themselves while performing their work. He also sees how much the children enjoy physical labor, chopping and sawing the wood. He gets frustrated when he watches them, and he wonders, am I reaching them at all? They are acting exactly as the old men who never attended school a day in their lives. Is it just a vicious circle? He worries that blacks are so used to their chains, they have come to like them. Going along with the whites is easier than fighting them, and the children's enjoyment of the physical work makes compliance still easier. Gaines suggests that racism is particularly difficult to root out when it comes cloaked in kindness. Edna Guidry feels empathy and goodwill for Grant, but she treats him as her inferior. She asks him questions but answers them herself. She makes observations about his life and the lives of his friends without letting him make his own observations. Edna acts out the role that she learned to play. Moreover, in emphasizing Edna's reliance upon bourbon, Gaines implies that alcohol plays a part in preventing Edna from truly showing compassion for Grant, or other black people, for that matter. Alcohol also plays a role in Grant's inability to change. Grant takes Miss Emma to the jail in Bayonne. When they arrive, they meet two deputies, Clark and Paul. Clark orders Paul to search through the package Emma has brought for Jefferson. After a thorough inspection, they allow Emma and Grant into Jefferson's cell. They find Jefferson lying flat on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. Jefferson does not respond to Emma's questions. He refuses her food too, merely saying, "It don't matter." She asks him to clarify, and he tells her, "Nothing don't matter." In a vague manner, he asks when they are going to execute him. Emma does not understand his question, but Grant does. Emma continues to talk, but she cannot get him to say much else. The next two visits follow a similar pattern. On the day of the fourth visit, Tant Lou tells Grant that Miss Emma is ill and cannot go to the prison today. Grant enters the house to find Miss Emma in her chair, coughing unconvincingly. Grant thinks she is feigning illness because she and his aunt expect him to go to the jail alone from now on. Grant is angry and tells them he feels humiliated performing the duties they ask of him. Through her tears, Miss Emma apologizes for humiliating him, but says she has no one else to whom she can turn for help. Grant departs. When Grant gets to Jefferson's cell, he is unsure of what to say. He asks Jefferson if he is hungry. Jefferson asks if Grant has brought any corn, saying that hogs eat corn. Grinning angrily, Jefferson acts like a hog, kneeling down and sticking his head in the bag of food Grant brought. Grant watches him carefully and asks if Jefferson is trying to make him feel guilty so that Grant will leave him alone. He says white men think Jefferson's situation is hopeless. Jefferson does not respond. Grant wants to ask Jefferson what he is thinking about, but he stifles the impulse. Grant knows he will have to lie to protect Miss Emma from the news of Jefferson's disturbing anger, but he cannot face her. He drives to the Rainbow Club. Sitting at the bar, he listens to some old men talking about Jackie Robinson and remembers the excitement and pride the town felt when the boxer Joe Louis achieved heroic success. He recalls a recurring dream he used to have in which a young man on his way to the electric chair cried out for Joe Louis to save him. He wonders if Jefferson would call out to Jackie Robinson for help. Grant quickly leaves the bar and walks to the school where Vivian teaches the 6th and 7th grades. Grant finds Vivian working quietly at her desk. He asks her to leave town with him that night, but she reminds him that they should not be seen together. She does not want to give her husband any excuse to take her children. He tells her about his visit to Jefferson's cell and, once again, he tells her he wants to leave the South forever. She says he cannot bring himself to leave because he loves his people more than he hates the South. Grant says that he wants more than he has. Before they leave to get a drink, Vivian tells him that most of the teachers and students at her school know about their love affair. Grant and Jefferson view each other as foes. During Grant's first solo visit to Jefferson's cell, Jefferson shows that he took offense at his lawyer's words, but in the absence of a true enemy to rage against, he takes out his anger on Grant. Jefferson makes it clear that being called a hog angers him more than the death sentence does. Sheriff Guidry says Jefferson can die like a contented hog, but Jefferson is not contented, animalistic, or stupid. He realizes that his lawyer's words denied him his humanity, his will, and his spirit. Like Jefferson, Grant feels trapped and humiliated. He bemoans having to visit Jefferson, particularly if he has to go alone. Although Grant does not show the same amount of aggression that Jefferson does in the cell, Grant's will to abandon Jefferson and the South can itself be seen as an aggressive affront. Grant's inability to see the good that might come from his visits with Jefferson prevents him from interacting positively with Jefferson. Instead of calmly dealing with Jefferson's outburst, Grant reacts in an accusatory and almost petty fashion, asking Jefferson if he is trying to make him feel guilty. Miss Emma goes to church on Determination Sunday when church members sing their favorite hymns and tell the congregation where they will spend eternity. Grant recalls last Friday, when he came back from talking to Vivian. He had found Miss Emma and Reverend Ambrose sitting with his aunt in the kitchen. Miss Emma asked him about his visit to Jefferson's cell, and he lied and says that Jefferson seemed to be doing well and that he had eaten some of the food she had sent him. Reverend Ambrose tried to determine whether or not Grant intended to teach Jefferson within a Christian framework. Reverend Ambrose had visited Jefferson, and he wanted to know if Grant had been undermining his teachings with cynical secularism. Grant became impatient with this line of questioning. After years of hard studying in academia, he no longer believes in the teachings of the Bible. After his aunt returns from church, Grant sits at his desk correcting papers. He remarks that, up until his last year at the university, he participated in the church. He says that studying ate up most of his time and that he became distant from his faith in the church, angering Tante Lou. Professor Antoine told him he should leave Bayonne for good, and Grant tried visiting his parents in California. Nevertheless, he returned to Bayonne to teach, where he cannot escape the influence of the Black Church. He says that he is running in place, unable to accept what used to be my life, unable to leave it. Suddenly, Vivian surprises Grant with a visit to his house. Vivian has never been to Grant's house before. He gives her a small tour and offers her some coffee and cake. She insists they wash their plates after eating, even though Grant tells her that his aunt would take care of the dishes. He asks her to take a walk with him, and she consents. They walk through the plantation, past a cemetery, and onto the sugarcane fields. They make love on the field, concealed by the cane. Afterward, they discuss possible names for their future children, and Grant says he does not want to raise his children in this community. After some time, they return home. Vivian says that she hopes Grant's family will like her. She comes from a light-skinned mulatto community called Freelaw Cove, but she married a very dark-skinned man whom she met while attending Xavier University. She kept the marriage secret because she knew her family would object. When she finally told them, they shunned her and her new family. Even now, after her separation from her husband, she never speaks to her family. They find Tante Lou, Miss Emma, and others at his aunt's house. Grant introduces Vivian. He insists on making coffee, because he and Vivian drank it all earlier, but his aunt objects, wishing to take charge in her own home. The tension between them makes the other ladies uncomfortable. Tante Lou asks Vivian about her background and beliefs. Vivian goes to church regularly, although it's to the Catholic Church. Tante Lou presses Vivian about whether she would drop her religion to marry Grant, the atheist. Vivian says she hopes she would not have to do that, but that if she had to, she would. Grant quickly ushers Vivian onto the porch. Vivian tells Grant that she is happy to know that at least other families criticize their children as much as her family does. Grant insists that his family differs from hers. Vivian becomes very quiet and then says she must go. The ladies say that Vivian is a lady of quality and encourage her to remain a Christian woman. After the interrogation, Vivian leaves gratefully with Grant. They watch a black girl and her boyfriend walking home from church holding hands. Grant thinks to himself, "Good luck." On Monday, Grant sees Tant Lou, Reverend Ambrose, and Miss Emma returning from visiting Jefferson. They stop at Miss Emma's house and go inside. In school, Grant finds his students planning for the annual Christmas program. He reminds them to keep just one person in mind this Christmas season, referring to Jefferson. At her request, Grant visits Miss Emma. Miss Emma knows Grant lied about his previous visit to Jefferson. Because her own visit was disturbing, Jefferson asked her if she had any corn for a hog, asking viciously and repeatedly until Miss Emma grew so distressed that she slapped him. Grant is irritated, feeling once again that he cannot help Jefferson and stating that he will not let Jefferson make him feel guilty. Tant Lou insists that Grant continue his visits. Over the course of the week, Grant feels his anger dissipating. He reflects on the fact that he never stays angry for a long time, although he never believes in anything for very long either. On Friday, when Grant enters Jefferson's cell, he has no idea how to help Jefferson. He tries talking about Miss Emma and the pain Jefferson causes her. Jefferson says that Grant wouldn't be talking about love and compassion if Grant sat on death row. Jefferson says he never asked to be born. Saying that Grant's visits anger him, Jefferson threatens to scream and cause a ruckus. Grant thinks that despite Jefferson's angry words, his eyes indicate that he needs Grant. Jefferson says only the living need to have good manners. Then he throws his food on the floor. At Guidry's request, Grant enters his office and stands for a few minutes, waiting as the sheriff talks on the phone. When Guidry finally hangs up, he asks Grant whether or not he sees an improvement in Jefferson, and Grant answers sincerely that he does not. Guidry is angry, and Grant finds out later that his anger stems from a visit Miss Emma paid to Mrs. Guidry, during which she asked if she could meet with Jefferson in the dayroom or in some other large room so that she could sit down. Grant denies Guidry's accusation that Grant encouraged Miss Emma to make the request. Guidry asks Clark and a fat man named Frank what he should do. Clark declares that Jefferson should remain in his cell. Frank declines to answer, and Guidry decides to ask Jefferson what he would prefer. Still, Guidry says, even if Jefferson gets to go to the dayroom, he will have to be in shackles. As promised, Guidry asks Jefferson if he would like to meet his visitors in the dayroom, and he says he would. When Miss Emma, Tant Lou, and Reverend Ambrose visit Jefferson in the dayroom, Jefferson's arms and legs are shackled. He sits down at the table and Miss Emma tries to feed him, but he refuses to eat. The community has located a pine tree and raised enough money to buy clothes for Jefferson. Grant's class puts on a Christmas program and Reverend Ambrose delivers the introductory prayer, commenting on the foolishness of those who believe themselves educated when they have no love for the Lord. Grant contains his irritation. During the Christmas program, a particularly dramatic recitation of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas" affects everyone deeply, but Grant becomes depressed thinking about the monotony of their routine. Every year they put on the same play and sing the same songs. He wonders whether anything will ever change in his town. A young child brings Grant some food, and he sits looking at the gift intended for Jefferson. The date of Jefferson's execution has been set, and Grant goes to Henry Pitchett's house. Reverend Ambrose has already arrived at Pitchett's, but Sheriff Guidry has not. The housekeeper assures Grant that Guidry is on his way, but Grant is dubious. After a few minutes, however, Guidry arrives. Guidry informs the others that Jefferson will die between noon and 3 on the second Friday after Easter. The mayor did not want the execution to be any closer to Easter or during Lent. Grant bitterly thinks about the fact that 12 white men convicted Jefferson, and now a white man has set the date of his death. He wonders how any man could set the date of another's death and questions whether this procedure deserves to be called justice. Grant visits Miss Emma, who lies under a quilt on her bed, looking extremely ill. Grant badly wants to leave, but he knows he should spend at least a few minutes there. After 10 minutes, he returns to his aunt's house where Vivian pays him a visit. Vivian says she wants to stop by Miss Emma's but does not know whether it is a good time. Grant tells Vivian he wants her to be part of his life and that his aunt will have to accept that. They get out of bed and go to Miss Emma's. Vivian whispers something into Miss Emma's ear and Emma looks pleased. At the Rainbow Club, Grant and Vivian drink brandy, and he tells her why he thinks his aunt and Miss Emma ask so much of him. He says they want to take pride in him, just as Miss Emma wants to take pride in Jefferson. Vivian has put down her glass and says she does not understand. Grant says black men have historically failed to protect their women, either staying in the South and losing their will, or running away and leaving the women to look after the children. Grant insists that even those who try to change things will break because they must shoulder the burdens of all those who have failed before them. It is a vicious circle. Miss Emma and Tant Lou cling to Grant, he says, because they see that he is different from other men. They do not understand, however, that by holding on to him they force him to shoulder a terrible burden and facilitate his destruction. When Vivian asks how they can break the circle, Grant replies, "It's up to Jefferson, my love." Although Grant wants to help his community, he feels powerless to do so. This feeling of powerlessness makes him bitter. At the Christmas program, he reflects that nothing changes, not the songs, not the clothes, not the people. Grant feels he cannot help or change these people, and in order to stop this failure from hurting him, he nurtures anger and contempt toward the people he says he wants to help. He fans the flames of his superiority and separates himself from the happiness of the group. Still, despite his best efforts to be callous, Grant notices sights and moments that depress him with their tenderness. A girl in his class gives a lovely and affecting reading of "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." A present for Jefferson sits against the pathetic Christmas tree, a present the children bought with their own contributions of nickels and dimes. A plate of food brought to Grant by a child who has noticed his misery. Reverend Ambrose's introductory prayer challenges Grant to show true faith. The Reverend thinks that when you believe in God, you not only comfort yourself, you take a step toward fighting the injustice of a white-dominated society. God is a source of hope, change, and rebellion. Moreover, if you have faith in God, you have faith in your people. Nevertheless, Grant is not up to that challenge, at least not yet. Reverend Ambrose's sermon is a precursor for his diatribe against Grant in a later chapter. Grant goes to the courthouse to see Jefferson. Paul reluctantly searches the package of food for Jefferson. When Grant enters Jefferson's cell, the conversation goes much better this time. Grant asks Jefferson if he would like anything, and Jefferson responds that he would like a gallon of vanilla ice cream to make up for the rest of his life, when he never got enough ice cream. Jefferson likes Grant's offer to bring him a little radio. Grant borrows money from people at the Rainbow Club. He goes to a little store uptown to buy a small radio. The white sales clerk wants to give Grant the floor model instead of a brand new radio, but Grant stands his ground and the clerk caves in. Grant takes the radio to the courthouse, receives the sheriff's permission to give it to Jefferson, and gives the radio to Paul to deliver to Jefferson. When Miss Emma, Tant Lou, and Reverend Ambrose go to see Jefferson, they have to visit him in his cell because Jefferson refuses to leave his radio. They find him lying down on his bunk, staring at the wall and listening to music. He does not say a word. When they return home, Tant Lou blames Grant for the problem. Reverend Ambrose says that the radio is a sinful influence on Jefferson. Grant becomes furious. Last Friday was the first time Jefferson had ever opened up to him, and Grant refuses to take the radio away from Jefferson and potentially undo whatever progress he has made. Grant goes back to see Jefferson. He brings a big bag of nuts that his students gathered for Jefferson. When Grant asks Jefferson to meet Miss Emma in the day room next time, Jefferson consents. Grant offers to bring Jefferson a little notebook so that he can write down any thoughts that come to his mind, and Jefferson agrees to the plan. As Grant leaves, Jefferson asks him with some hesitation to thank the children for the nuts. Grant is overjoyed, and he feels as if he has found religion. Stifling his impulse to hug Jefferson, Grant squeezes Jefferson's hand kindly and leaves. Grant joins Miss Emma on her next visit to Jefferson, bringing along a notebook and pencil. In the day room, Jefferson refuses to eat at first. Grant asks Jefferson to walk with him around the room. As they walk, Grant tells Jefferson that a hero does something other men do not do or cannot do. Grant says that Grant is not a hero, but that Jefferson can be a hero. Grant tells Jefferson about the white myth that black people are not human. Grant says he cannot stand up to defy whites, and that the Reverend will not stand up to defy them, but Jefferson can do it. Grant tells Jefferson that he needs him more than Jefferson needs Grant. As Grant speaks, Jefferson cries quietly at his side, and Grant begins to cry too. Grant's experience in the department store shows how a racist society is racist even in its smallest interactions. Black citizens must depend on the caprices of whites, and if whites, such as the saleswoman who waits on Grant, do not feel like being fair, black people have no recourse. Although black people are no longer physically enslaved, in many ways, they are spiritually enslaved. Grant's refusal to bow down to the saleswoman's shoddy treatment represents a victory for him. He insists that she give him a new radio, and in the end she agrees. This turn of events does not seem like an immense victory, but it is an important one. Gaines suggests that the cunning evil of racism is the way it pervades daily life and begins to seem normal. Tiny moments that make black people feel second class add up to total oppression. Refusing to tolerate even minor shoddy treatment makes a difference. Grant cannot find Vivian at the Rainbow Club. He sits at the bar and orders a drink. In a corner behind him, two mulatto bricklayers talk loudly, hoping Grant will overhear them. Grant finally catches a few of their words. They state loudly that Jefferson should have been executed long ago. Grant tries to contain himself, but after a few minutes he loses control. He walks over and tells them to be quiet. A fight breaks out, during which Grant is knocked unconscious. When Grant wakes up, he finds himself in Vivian's bedroom. He discovers that Claiborne, unable to stop the fight, knocked him out, and that Vivian brought him here to recover. Despite her disapproval of violence, Vivian softens and asks Grant to stay the night. He knows that he should not, since her husband could return to try to get the children. She tells Grant that she needs more from him than he currently gives her, that she wants more consideration. Angry, he walks out of the room and stands at the front door. He looks out through the screen and into the darkness. He does not want to go outside, for he realizes that everything he cares for is in Vivian's house. After a few minutes, he returns to the kitchen and buries his face in Vivian's lap. Reverend Ambrose talks to Grant about Jefferson. He wants Grant to help him teach Jefferson about God, but Grant no longer believes in the church and refuses to help the Reverend. Reverend Ambrose gets angry and raises his voice to Grant, calling him boy and telling him that he is uneducated because he does not know or understand people. Grant says he cannot lie to Jefferson by pretending to believe in heaven or the Bible. Reverend Ambrose says he knows Grant looks down on him for lying, and he admits that he does lie in order to relieve people's pain, but he says that people lie to themselves and to others in order to make life bearable. He tells Grant that Tandlu has been lying to him all her life, telling herself and Grant she was fine when truly she was working her fingers to the bone in order to send him to college. When Grant next goes to visit Jefferson, he sees the notebook on the floor, next to the radio. He opens the notebook and finds that Jefferson has filled up 3/4 of the first page, though he clearly erased a great deal. He has written about dying, and about the difference between men and hogs. Grant asks him about Reverend Ambrose's last visit. Jefferson says Ambrose told him to pray, but that he does not pray because he doesn't know if heaven exists. Jefferson asks Grant if he prays and Grant replies honestly, saying he doesn't because he doesn't believe in anything. Grant says he feels lost. He tells Jefferson that he wants Jefferson to believe in something so that someday Grant can look to Jefferson as an example and start believing in something himself. Jefferson says that Reverend Ambrose told him to give up his possessions, which confuses Jefferson because he has so few possessions to give up. Grant says Jefferson may not have possessions, but he still has love to give. Jefferson says that everyone asks him to bear a cross, but no one ever bore his cross. Jefferson asks if Miss Emma or even Grant would go to the chair to save him. When Jefferson asks if Grant believes in God, Grant says he does. Jefferson says he wants to go to his death wordlessly, as Christ did. He talks of his execution, saying Grant asks too much of him. Jefferson says that he moved through his life working and grinning to get by, pandering to the whites, doing what he thought God asked of him, and now the people around him want him to change entirely. When Grant lowers his head, Jefferson accuses him of not being able to look at him. Grant looks, and sees Jefferson standing tall, not stooped. Jefferson asks Grant how the execution will feel. Grant continues to avert his gaze from Jefferson, but accepts a sweet potato when Jefferson offers it. In these chapters, Grant becomes not teacher but student. Grant is lost and needs Jefferson's help, as he admits to Jefferson. Grant also admits to the Reverend that he is lost. Reverend Ambrose says he himself is found, for he understands that the black community needs a church in order to bear life in the racist South. Ambrose also says that lying is necessary in order to make life endurable and to help others, like Grant, make progress in the world. Here Ambrose changes his tactics slightly. Before, he challenged Grant solely on religious grounds, insulting him as a secular teacher. Now he talks not just about faith in God, but about kindness to friends and family. This argument seems to reach Grant. In addressing these subjects, Ambrose highlights the absurdity facing the black community, namely, The fact that the community must continually compromise its own sense of ethical behavior honesty in order to survive in an unethical and racist world. Ambrose's emphasis on lying attracts Grant, because he too has had to lie in the past. For instance, when he lied to Miss Emma about Jefferson's aggression. Grant can identify with Ambrose's words here and even puts them into practice. When he speaks to Jefferson in Chapter 28, Grant tries to persuade him to believe in religion whether Jefferson believes it will be good for his soul or not. This chapter consists of Jefferson's diary. Jefferson has never received much formal education, and misspellings fill the diary. Some of the time, he addresses his writing to Grant, as if writing a letter. Jefferson writes about the other men in prison and wonders why poor people seem to suffer so much more than the rich do. He concludes that the Lord caters to white people. A few days later, Jefferson writes about Grant's assertion that he is better than white people think. Jefferson wants proof of his worth. He says he has never done so much thinking in his life, and he begins to realize how little he has always expected of himself. The Monday before Jefferson's execution, he writes that the sheriff, Mr. Pitchett, and Mr. Morgan visit him in his cell. Jefferson hears Mr. Morgan and Sheriff Guidry talking about their bet. Mr. Morgan wants to double the stakes. He bets that Grant will fail. Mr. Pitchett asks Jefferson how he is doing and then offers to sharpen his pencil with his own knife. Then, with Guidry's permission, Pitchett gives Jefferson the knife. Jefferson says he will give it back in a few days. During the next few days, people from all over town come to speak to Jefferson. His friend Bach reluctantly gives Jefferson one of his marbles, and Jefferson cries because no one has ever paid so much attention to him. Vivian comes with Grant to visit Jefferson on his last night. Jefferson is humiliated in front of her, for he has not bathed recently and thinks he is ugly, but Vivian tells him he looks handsome and strong. She kisses his face. Jefferson apologizes to Grant for crying when Grant told him he would not be at the execution. He explains that he cried because nobody was ever as good to him as Grant is nobody, but Grant made him feel he is somebody. Guidry asks what Jefferson wants for supper, and Jefferson asks for his godmother's cooking and a little ice cream for dessert. After Jefferson has dinner and a shower, Guidry asks him if he feels he was treated well. Jefferson says he does, and Guidry says he should write that in his tablet. Guidry offers to leave the light on so that he can continue to write. Jefferson cannot sleep and writes in his journal. He resolves to see the sunrise on his last morning. He says he cannot listen to the radio because it plays only for the living. Jefferson is afraid, but determined to stay strong. He writes goodbye to Mr. Wiggins and asks him to tell them I'm a man. He says he will give the diary to Paul to deliver to Grant. Jefferson's diary testifies to the mutual benefits he and Grant get from their friendship and love for one another. Grant bought the diary for Jefferson, and Jefferson writes in it usually as if writing a letter to Grant. Even when he is alone in his cell, Jefferson can write to Grant and feel he has companionship. As Jefferson writes down his thoughts, he begins to think seriously about the world and his role in it. Showing the influence of Grant's words, Jefferson writes that he realizes how important he has become to his community. Moreover, the diary will serve as a boon for Grant's self-confidence and his sense of self-worth, as he himself initiated the use of the diary by engaging Jefferson and buying him the notebook and pencil. The white characters are not uniformly cruel to Jefferson, although their token kindnesses do not matter much in the face of the death penalty their people imposed on Jefferson. Mr. Pitchett shows some compassion toward Jefferson by offering to sharpen his pencil and then giving him the knife as a gift. Guidry kindly offers to leave the light on so Jefferson can write. Also, in the past, Guidry has allowed numerous visitors to see Jefferson. Guidry asks Jefferson to speak well of him in the diary, perhaps both because he wants kind things written about him and because he is anxious for Jefferson to like him. On the morning before Jefferson's execution, a black truck with a gray tarpaulin cover drives into town. Many people stop to watch it pass. It goes through the business district and pulls into the courthouse. Vivian and Grant sit at the Rainbow Club the night before the execution. She tells him that from noon until she knows the execution is over, she will have her students kneel beside their desks. After saying good night to Vivian at 9 o'clock, Grant drives around for a while and then goes to his aunt's house. He notices a couple of cars parked in front of Miss Emma's, but he does not stop. At 6:30 the next morning, Sheriff Guidry sits down to breakfast, feeling nervous. He has never overseen an execution before. He tells his wife that he asked Grant if he would be present, but Grant shook his head. Guidry says Reverend Ambrose asked to attend the execution and Guidry said yes. He also asked the Reverend if one more person from the quarter would like to attend. At 8, Guidry goes to the courthouse and supervises the unloading process. Henry Vincent, the official executioner, tells the sheriff that the prisoner must be shaven. Guidry asks Paul to do it, and Paul reluctantly agrees. Jefferson remains quiet as Paul shaves his head, ankles, and wrists. As Paul leaves, Jefferson asks him to deliver the notebook to Grant and to keep the radio for himself. Paul says he cannot keep the radio, but he promises to give it to the other inmates. He accepts Jefferson's gift of a marble. Jefferson asks Paul if he plans to attend the execution and Paul says yes. As the hour of Jefferson's execution approaches, Grant steps outside the schoolhouse. He remembers old friends, classmates, and baseball teammates. Many of his friends have died, mostly as a result of violence. Grant stifles tears for Jefferson, saying that there will be too many more like him, and he cannot cry for all of them. He thinks of calling Vivian or the Reverend. He thinks Reverend Ambrose is courageous for using the white man's God as a source of strength. Grant wonders if he has caused Jefferson to lose faith in God and asks Jefferson to forgive his foolishness if he has robbed him of faith. Grant says he puts his faith in Jefferson. At 10 minutes before noon, Grant lines up his students and asks them to kneel. He goes back outside. He wonders what Jefferson is doing at this very minute and asks himself why he is not with Jefferson, or inside praying with his students. Angry, Grant says that he refuses to believe in the same God worshipped by the jurors that convicted Jefferson. Tant Lou, Miss Emma, and Reverend Ambrose believe in God because it frees their minds and gives their bodies a chance to be free. Grant says he knows this because he knows what it means to be a slave. I am a slave. Ernest J. Gaines was born on a Louisiana plantation in 1933 in the midst of the Great Depression. He began working the fields when he was 9, digging potatoes for 50 cents a day. He spent most of his childhood with his aunt, Augustine Jefferson, a determined woman who had no legs but who managed to take care of her family. Gaines considered her the most courageous person he ever knew. At age 15, Gaines moved to Vallejo, California, where he joined his parents, who had moved there during World War II. In Vallejo, Gaines discovered the public library. Since he could not find many books written about African Americans, he decided to write his own. A few years later, he enrolled at San Francisco State University and took writing courses at Stanford University. In 1964, Gaines published his first novel, Catherine Carmier. He published the novel Of Love and Dust 3 years later, followed by a short story collection entitled Bloodline 1968 and another entitled A Long Day in November 1971. He received little attention for these efforts, but felt happy about his progress as a writer. In 1971, Gaines completed one of his most famous novels, The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman. The novel follows the life of a fictional woman, Jane Pittman, who is born a slave and lives to see the black militancy of the 1960s. After the critical and financial success of The Autobiography of Miss Jane Pittman, Gaines published several more novels on the topic closest to his own heart, the black communities of Louisiana. The most successful of these was A Lesson Before Dying, which was nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and, in 1993, won the National Book Critics Circle Award. Gaines's novel investigates the difficulties facing blacks in the rural South during the 1940s, but the historical context of the novel spans almost a century. Following the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Jim Crow era commenced in the 1880s and continued through the turn of the century and up until 1964. This era contained the systematic destruction of black farmers in the South at the hands of resentful whites who sought to undermine black entitlement to property, animals, financial support, and even wages. The Jim Crow era also brought with it severe segregation laws that affected every area of life and the development of white racist organizations, such as the Ku Klux Klan, which terrorized black communities. As a result, between 1 and 2 million black farmers left the South during the First Great Migration from 1914 to 1930, in search of work in northern cities where factory owners promised, but never provided, high-wage jobs. In the 1940s, with the outbreak of World War II, a second great migration brought black farmers from the rural areas in the South to the urban, industrial areas primarily in the northern and western United States in search of higher-paying jobs in the burgeoning industrial economy. The second wave of migration from the rural countryside to the cities brought greater success, if only relatively. Between 1910 and 1970, more than 6 million blacks left the South. A Lesson Before Dying highlights the tension inherent in the lives of African Americans during the 1940s. Gaines highlights how the pull away from the South divided blacks from their heritage and their roots, stranding them in a world where, it seemed, one had to look, talk, and act white in order to succeed. At the same time, however, remaining connected with one's roots with the rural South meant having to live in a world fraught with Jim Crow laws and racial segregation, which remained in existence until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Racial violence and hatred pervaded all sectors of American society, but were felt most acutely in the rural South. The protagonist of the novel, Grant, is the son of cane cutters who labored on a Louisiana plantation. He grows up working in a menial job, but makes his escape and goes to college. He returns to his hometown a secular, educated man, distanced from his downtrodden black community. College has given him a more sophisticated perspective and an educated way of thinking and speaking. Yet despite the changes in Grant, white people still consider him inferior. Their shoddy treatment outrages Grant, but he says nothing and does nothing. He feels rage at the whites for treating him badly and rage at himself for taking the treatment lying down. This rage, bottled up in Grant, turns to bitterness, cynicism, and self-absorption. He feels he cannot help his community, and in order to stop this failure from paining him, he removes himself from the people he loves, looking on them with contempt and deciding that, since they are beyond hope, he cannot be blamed for failing to help them. Grant's perspective changes over the course of the novel as a result of his visits to Jefferson and his interactions with Vivian, his Aunt Tant Lou, and Reverend Ambrose. He learns to love something other than himself and to strive for change without retreating into his shell of cynicism. Still, Gaines does not suggest that because Grant's attitude improves, he will be able to effect great change. He does not even suggest that Grant's attitude improves entirely. Jefferson dies nobly, but he still dies, murdered by his racist oppressors. Grant ends the novel encouraged by the changes he has seen, but depressed at the barbarity of his society. He is still afraid, he is still withdrawn from some people, and he is still sarcastic and angry. Grant's character development suggests that although great personal and societal improvement is possible, no quick fix will help a racist community, and for that reason Grant is justified in his despair. The novel centers around Jefferson's unjust conviction and his friends' attempts to help him die with human dignity. A relatively simple man, Jefferson has spent his entire life on the plantation, working for poor wages. He has always worked without protest, believing that his place in the world is a lowly one. When Jefferson's lawyer defends Jefferson by likening him to a mindless hog, Jefferson becomes terrified and infuriated, obsessed by the possibility that he really is no better than a hog. He rages in his cell, mimicking a hog's behavior and jeering at his friends and family, or refusing to speak to them. When Grant visits Jefferson for the first time, Jefferson is so withdrawn and sullen that Grant thinks it will be impossible to help him. Jefferson does change with Grant's help, however. He begins to believe in his own worth, and he realizes his life and manner of dying might have symbolic importance for his community. Gaines casts Jefferson as a Christ figure, a man to whom people look for their own salvation. Jefferson becomes brave and thoughtful, and his journal reveals the truth that even the most woefully uneducated man can possess depths of intelligence and lyricism. Grant Wiggins has been teaching on a plantation outside Bayonne, Louisiana, for several years when a slow-witted man named Jefferson is convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Jefferson claims he is innocent of the crime. He says he was on his way to a bar, but changed his mind and decided to tag along with two men who were on their way to a liquor store. Upon arriving there, the two men began arguing with the store owner, and a shootout ensued. The store owner and the two men died, and Jefferson remained at the scene of the crime. He was arrested and tried for murder. Jefferson's lawyer argues in court that Jefferson is nothing but a poor fool, hardly more worthwhile than a hog, and therefore incapable of plotting such a scheme. The jury quickly brings back a guilty verdict. Upon hearing the lawyer's speech, Jefferson's godmother, Miss Emma, resolves to help Jefferson die like a man, not a hog. She asks Grant to help her, knowing that he will resist. Grant left many years prior to attend college, and he returned an educated man. He deplores the injustices done to his fellow black men, but he does not want to get involved in Jefferson's case. However, after considerable pressure from his aunt, Tant Lou, he agrees to try to help Jefferson. Grant, Miss Emma, and Grant's aunt go to visit Jefferson in his cell, and they discover that he too heard the lawyer's words and has taken them to heart. Silent and moody, Jefferson resists Grant's feeble attempts to reach him. The three visitors spend an uncomfortable hour in the cell and then leave. During the next few visits, Jefferson continues to frustrate Grant's attempts to communicate. When Grant attempts to teach Jefferson about dignity, Jefferson insists that dignity is for humans, not hogs. He eats and snuffles an imitation of a hog and tries to anger Grant with stubbornness and malice, but Grant maintains his patience. Each hour-long visit ends in failure, but Grant continues to try to reach Jefferson. On his fourth visit, Grant sparks a conversation with Jefferson about his final meal. Jefferson admits that he wants a gallon of vanilla ice cream because, although he loves ice cream, he has never had more than a thimbleful at a time. This admission begins to break down the barrier between the two men. Grant borrows money from some townspeople and buys Jefferson a small radio. On his next visit, he brings Jefferson a notebook and asks him to write down whatever thoughts come to his mind. Jefferson promises to do so, and by Grant's next visit, Jefferson has filled most of a page with thoughts concerning the difference between hogs and men. Grant's relationships with his girlfriend Vivian and with Reverend Ambrose begin to intensify. Despite her love for Grant, Vivian dislikes his tendency to think only of himself, showing little regard for her needs. Grant uses Vivian to escape the troubles of his life, and he continually suggests that they run away from their hometown and their past in the South. The Reverend Ambrose, himself unable to reach Jefferson, urges Grant to put aside his atheistic beliefs and help save not just Jefferson's character, but his soul. The Reverend declares that Grant must learn to tell lies for the good of others. Grant focuses his energy on Jefferson and tries to explain the importance of Jefferson's death. Jefferson asks Grant if he believes in heaven, and Grant replies that he does not, although he qualifies this remark by saying that his atheism does not make him a good man. In fact, Grant says, Jefferson will save even Grant's atheistic soul if he carries the cross for the sinners on earth. Grant explains that the black community in the quarter has spent centuries enslaved to white men, and that when Jefferson's attorney called him a hog, he attacked the will and intelligence of the entire black society. In consequence, Jefferson now has the opportunity to stand up for his community. He has become a symbol to his people, and the manner in which he faces his death will bear on their self-confidence and potential. Over the next few weeks, Jefferson continues to write in his journal. In March, the governor of Louisiana sets the execution date for 2 weeks after Easter. As news of Jefferson's impending death spreads through the town, more and more people begin to visit him. Young children and old men, strangers and friends, all come to Jefferson's cell to speak to him. The onslaught of attention makes Jefferson begin to understand the enormity of the task that Grant has given him. He realizes that he has become much more than an ordinary man, and that his death will represent much more than an ordinary death. Elated by Jefferson's progress, Grant nevertheless dreads the execution day, when that progress will be tested. Grant cannot bring himself to attend the execution, for he has grown very close to Jefferson. At the time the execution is scheduled to take place, he orders his students to kneel by their desks in honor of Jefferson. He steps outside the classroom, distressed and bewildered. He knows he should have attended the execution. A few minutes later, a deputy comes down from the courthouse and informs Grant that the execution is over. He assures Grant that Jefferson was the bravest man in the room that morning. Grant looks out over the town, numb and heavy-hearted, and discovers that he is crying. Guidry is both an archetypal white authoritarian and a decent man. Guidry voices the ignorance, hypocrisy, inertia, and racism of the people in power in the South of the 1940s. As town sheriff, Guidry has plenty of power to wield. He resents any trespasses on his sphere of influence, and he wants to maintain the status quo in his courthouse and in his society. He believes that Jefferson should be left to die in happy, animalistic ignorance. Still, as soon as Jefferson and Grant begin to transcend the roles that Guidry and other powerful whites assign for them, as soon as they cease playing the humble schoolteacher and the angry, Stupid criminal Guidry seems to sense the fragility of his position. His worldview depends upon blacks conforming to these stereotypes. When they refuse to conform, Guidry becomes unsure of his footing. Although Guidry does not repent and change, he does show signs of increasing sensitivity. His harsh exterior begins to crack and reveal a kindly, anxious streak. By the end of the novel, he treats Jefferson with something approaching respect.